So with the dice shape here, we had kind of an easy job here because what we did was we had a decent layout. So if we look in the UV editor, it was simply laid out in this T shape, and all we had to do was go into Photoshop and sort of place everything in the right place. Now, this isn't always going to work great to use what automatically comes out of Maya as a UV layout. So we're going to look at some of the UV layout tools and see how we can do other things and use other sorts of projections and things to create this layout, because it's not always going to be laid out nicely like this. The cube is a simple shape, and that's why we're starting with it. But let's take a look at some of the other tools here and see what we can do to change the way that the UV layout is composed. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go into the general editors here, or in the render editors, and we're going to change this texture here. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to change from my material. I'm going to change the material here. So I saved this cube texture, and we're going to use this cube texture so it looks like a cube puzzle, as you can see. But you'll notice in the UV layout, when I go back and I have to select my object here, you'll notice that it really doesn't match at all. So this is a T shape, and it's sort of an upside down T shape. This is a cross shape, and it's laying on its side. So there are ways to lay out the UV and really change where this placement is without affecting the geometry here. But let's take a look at some of the other options we have available to us, which are projections. So the first thing you can look at here is if you go to the UV menu, you'll notice that there's a bunch of different options here. We'll try the cylindrical projection, and you'll notice, so we can take this is good for like mapping a bottle or something like that, or a cylindrical shape, but it's not going to be particularly great for trying to map a cube. So as you can see, if this was a bottle and I wanted to kind of wrap this around it, it would be fairly easy to do. But it's not going to work for our cube here. So let's take a look at some of the other options here. Planar also can work. You'll notice that I can kind of do one side here, but it's not going to be correct for the sides. So it's only really projecting in one axis. In this case, it looks like the x-axis, and the sides get stretched, as you notice when I turn to the sides. Let's take a look at spherical. So with spherical, we can also kind of stretch it around and pretend that the cube is a sphere, but obviously that's not going to work either. Now, if we did have a sphere, this would be a very good example. If we had a globe map or something like that, it might work very well. Now let's take a look at the planar again, because it looked like the planar could almost work if we can only project it on each side, and we can actually do that. So let's go ahead and do planar. Now you'll notice that it's kind of projected, everything kind of got stretched, and we don't really want it stretched across that axis. So the way to fix that is to really change the option in the projection map when we create it, and we have to open up the options in the planar. So let's go to the planar, and in this case we want to project on the y-axis. I'm going to say project. So you notice now I can just kind of scale that up and move it around, and I can do each side individually. So I've already got this side worked out pretty well, and if I want to go ahead and do one of the other sides, once I'm kind of happy with this, then I can go ahead and select another side. So with polygons, unlike with NURBS, I can individually select components and create different projections for them, whereas I can't do that with a NURB surface. So let's take a look at the planar again, and this time I can do it on the x-axis and apply. And you notice that works out pretty good. So I can go ahead and do that. This is a sort of a lower level workflow, and it can work for you. However, there are better ways to do this. And we're also going to do something a little different so that we get a better idea of how to use UV shells and use the UV editor rather than trying to do everything sort of as a projection. But this method does work, and it will work for a lot of different things. So let's take a look at what our options are if we want to go ahead and work in the UV editor window here. Now what we'll do is we're going to look at this last type of projection here, and then we'll move on into how to use the UV editor. So we're just going to go into the UV editor and we're going to say automatic mapping. So we're just going to use automatic. Now you notice that automatic mapping kind of does the projections for us in all the different directions that we want. So we have a top, bottom, left, right, front, and back projection. However, they're not really fitting in the places that we want to on this map. So in our next section here, we're going to go ahead and look how we can work with the UV shells and how we can go ahead and use this UV editor to work with UVs for placement rather than trying to project things onto various components of the object.